Darlantia, Book 1 by Michael Gardner. Read by Michael Gardner. Chapter 5. Darlantia playfully swooped and soared across the sky over the last few miles of Dragon Kingdom. Filled with excitement and a sense of adventure, he had made swift progress on his southwest trajectory towards the warring kingdoms. It was a clear day, and it wasn't long before the great wilderness rose up before him, an endless sea of coniferous trees, such as pine, cedar, hemlock, and in some spots the mighty redwoods. Darlantia had seen this sight before, but had only ever flown around the border. As his mother and most other dragons said, the forest is no home for a dragon. They said this for good reason, as it would be impossible for even the smallest dragons to fly successfully within the forest itself. The use of fire could cause unnecessary destruction, and there was rarely anywhere suitable to make a home. As a result, no dragon made their home beyond the confines of Dragon Kingdom, and those wishing to explore or live permanently abroad had to fly over this grand obstacle. That said, it wouldn't be possible for Darlantia to make the trip to the warring kingdoms without at least a bit of rest, and so he was already contemplating when and where he would make his short pit stop. As Darlantia began the long flight over the expanse of trees, he watched the canopy closely. Even his great eyesight could not penetrate the shield of leaves and branches below. Many species of bird dived below the trees as his winged shadow floated across the gentle sway of the trees. Darlantia knew that the forest was home to thousands of species of various animals and beasts, many of which could even pose a risk to a young dragon such as himself, like a basilisk with its deadly venom. That said, apart from the humans in the warring kingdoms, no humanoid or intelligent races have been able to carve out a home for themselves in the great wilderness, unless you believe the ramblings of the ancient dragons, who spoke of four-armed warriors who apparently lurked in the darkest confines. Whatever prowled in the trees below, Darlantia knew he had to be vigilant, but, his enthusiasm and excitement getting the better of him, he flew on rather than resting, and shied away from what could have been a good spot for rest, such as on the banks of rivers where he could get a clear take-off. So, after the course of the day, Darlantia made incredible progress. His flight path, if he had flown correctly, meant he wasn't far off the eastern coast of the continent, and thus just a few hours away from the northernmost of the human kingdoms. The long continuous flight, however, meant that as the sun began to set, Darlantia began to feel fatigued. As the exhaustion set in, Darlantia began to hover more lazily above the tops of the trees. It was when his tail was drooping below to brush the tree line that in the distance Darlantia could see a few faint plumes of smoke rising into the sky. He adjusted his flight to investigate, climbing steadily into the sky. As he approached the smoke, his keen hearing detected the sounds of a vast assortment of various animals and wildlife, frenzied and panicked. Amidst the commotion he also detected the shouts and cries of human dialect. As Darlantia flew over the smoke to discern exactly what was happening, there was a bellowing shout from a human, whose loud voice cut through the rest of the rabble, swiftly followed by an explosive bang. In horror, Darlantia saw a large chained net explode from the canopy in front of him. Before he was able to take any evasive maneuvers, it struck him. Attached to the net were large metal balls, the weight of which meant that Darlantia was immediately sent crashing down into the trees. The leaves and branches cushioned the fall somewhat, but the weight of both net and dragon meant he soon crashed onto the forest floor. Somewhat dazed, Darlantia tried to quickly take in the situation. Around him were a dozen or so men, brandishing spears, wearing animal pelts and a light leather armor dyed red and adorned with a black scorpion. In the hands of around half of them were misty white containers. The first of the men lobbed one of these containers at Darlantia's head. The glass projectile smashed, releasing a hazy white gas that instantly made him feel sleepy and sluggish. He tried to struggle out of the confines of the net that still enveloped him, to no avail. More shouting and well-aimed white containers were thrown at him. Try as he might to fight it, by the time the sixth vial had released its soporific fumes, Darlantia was completely unconscious. By the time Darlantia regained consciousness, it was nightfall. He was unable to move much, having been transferred into an ill-fitting metal cage. He was faced towards the forest, but, shifting his head ever so slightly, he was able to better understand his situation. Behind him was a camp, filled with tents, fires, and lots of men celebrating with food and drink. Amongst the camp were various tools, such as nets, cages, stacks of the white misty gas, and other implements made with one objective in mind: capture. Darlantia now understood why he had heard the commotion of various animals, as dotted about the camp were other creatures confined in cages, a wyvern, a unicorn, and even a basilisk amongst a dozen other creatures. Piecing it all together, it seemed clear to Darlantia that the humans were hunters and trappers, who likely sold rare animals for currency. They must have ventured here from the warring kingdoms, but the language they spoke was unfamiliar to Darlantia, which likely meant they were foreigners from another continent. Intriguing, as perhaps the warring kingdoms were not so isolated anymore, and perhaps the hunters sold the creatures to be used as weapons. None of this helped the current situation, of course, and he began to feel enraged and frustrated at his own foolishness. His adventure cut short before it had really got going. If he struggled enough, perhaps he could somehow break the sturdy cage. He doubted these hunters had expected to run into a dragon, and so perhaps the enclosure wouldn't be able to hold him forever. He supposed, however, that if he struggled openly, then the hunters would put him down with more of the white gas. Alternatively, he could somehow use his fire to escape or defend himself. He was faced away from the hunters and their camp, and didn't want to harm the other captured creatures. The joyous humans continued to indulge in food and drink, laughing and celebrating loudly. It was likely a live dragon would make them famous and rich beyond reason. The other creatures were being tormented with spears and riled up on purpose. A group of the men did the same with Darlantia, but he was able to remain calm and unfazed, much to their annoyance. What looked like a leader of sorts came and faced Darlantia head on. He splashed his drink on the dragon's face and began to bark in his strange dialect. In response, Darlantia let out a quick roar and a burst of flame from his nostrils, causing the man to fall back on the floor in fear and surprise. The rest of the men laughed vigorously, and the leader, getting to his feet, threw the cup at them, before quickly withdrawing from Darlantia. The men left him alone after that incident, and he was able to scheme his escape in peace. Disappointingly, he still remained uncertain how best to carry it out. After a while, the noise of the camp died out as the men retired to their tents, with only a few drowsy guards left chatting amongst themselves. It was at this moment that Darlantia heard the dragon language faintly in the trees ahead of him. Oh dear, what a shame to see," the voice whispered. Darlantia raised his head in surprise. There was no way a dragon could have snuck up on the camp like this. All these poor creatures, and a dragon among them. Oh, what a shame, the voice came again sorrowfully. Darlantia decided to whisper back to the voice. Who goes there? He asked. Whoa, you can understand me, the voice chirped back. You are speaking dragon, Darlantia explained. Dragon? I didn't know I could speak dragon, it said to itself. There was a rustle of leaves, and from the nearby tree there flew a small creature, who landed on the ground in front of Darlantia. "How goes it?" asked the sparrow. I could be better, all things considered," Darlantia said. "Oh yes, I'm sorry to see you in such a terrible situation," said the sparrow. "Tell me, how can a sparrow speak the dragon language?" "I'm not really sure. I can speak all sorts of languages, all except the sparrow language, it seems, as none of the other sparrows like to be near me," the sparrow answered, hopping about excitedly as it spoke. Darlantia had never heard of a creature like a sparrow being able to speak any language, let alone multiple. The creature was clearly intelligent and self-aware, perhaps some kind of magic or spell. For now, he decided to simply accept the situation. "My name is Darlantia, and you are?" he asked. "They call me Twittle. No, wait, I call myself Twittle. Not many creatures in these woods like me talk to them, really. But I guess you have no choice." Twittle flapped his wings and laughed chirpily at his own little joke. "Twittle, do you think you could help me and the other captured creatures?" Darlantia asked. "Of course, but how?" "This cage is sturdy, but the door is locked by a simple key. If you can find that key and release me, then I can free the other creatures as well, and wreck this wretched camp of the humans in the process." "A delightful plan indeed," Twittle said, "but devilishly dangerous for a humble sparrow such as myself." "I'm sorry. I was thinking of my own fate, and gave little thought to your safety," Darlantia said regretfully. "Nonsense!" Twittle suddenly chirped. "I never said I wouldn't do it." Before Darlantia could respond, the bird took flight into the camp, and there was little Darlantia could do but wait. It wasn't until just before dawn that Darlantia heard the jingle of keys and the frantic flapping of wings as Twittle emerged into view, dragging an assortment of metal keys across the ground. "Phew!" he panted as he landed in front of Darlantia. "Lucky for us, all these men are still sleeping off last night's celebrations." "I was starting to get worried," Darlantia said. "Ha! Have no fear, my new dragon friend, for the brave sparrow Twittle has been on a mighty quest." "Indeed? Is that so?" Darlantia smiled at his new friend's little words. "Oh yes, indeed, for you see I have not been idle, but instead have laid out a cunning plan." "Do go on," Darlantia encouraged. "Well, after my sneaky exploits of finding the keys, I decided to spread the word around the camp of our daring rescue mission, and so every beast here is poised for escape. All that remains is to release you." "Perhaps you should have made sure you could get me out of here first," Darlantia suggested. "Ah, yes, I didn't think of that actually. But how hard can it be?" With that he took flight, flapping furiously towards the keyhole of Darlantia's cage. "This one? Nope. How about this one? Ah, no. Okay, let's try this, and aha! Oh, wait, no, too small. Okay, perhaps this one?" Behind them, Darlantia could hear murmurings among the camp as a man began to stir and awaken. "Hurry, Twittle," he said nervously. Oh dear, Twittle panted. Darlantia heard some commotion behind him, perhaps attracted by the loud jingle of keys. Just then there was suddenly a loud, satisfying click. "Aha, there we are," Twittle said, before dropping the keys and darting off into the trees. Darlantia head-butted the cage door and quickly unfurled himself from the confines of his enclosure. Turning quickly, he found he had been correct in thinking that some of the men had been attracted by the noise. He flapped his wings powerfully, sending them shouting and flying through the air. Darlantia then leapt towards the other cages, wrenching off the doors with his powerful claws. The other creatures had indeed been warned by Twittle, as they all stood ready to escape and were unfazed by Darlantia's extraordinary actions. The camp was on full alert within a matter of seconds, but Darlantia added to the confusion, knocking over the tents, setting fire to the supplies, and hurling the bottles of white mist at the men trying to take control of the chaos. Some of the creatures, like the basilisk, wyvern, and huge brown bear, leapt upon the humans in a crazed bloodlust, allowing the weaker or more peaceful creatures to flee into the forest unencumbered. Once Darlantia was sure most of the animals had escaped, he found the area in which he had fallen into the forest, and with all his strength launched himself above the trees and took flight. It wasn't long before Twittle joined him, flapping furiously to keep pace. "You have my thanks, Twittle," Darlantia said. "No problem, my dear new dragon friend," he shouted over the wind. "Say, where are you headed now, eh?" "I'm off to explore the warring kingdoms," he replied. "Care to join me?" "Warring kingdoms? You mean the peaceful kingdoms, surely," Twittle corrected. "Peaceful?" Chapter 6. Twittle had perched himself on top of Darlantia's head, and over the course of the morning's flight had told Darlantia all he knew about the current situation of the human kingdoms located on the continent. Apparently, after a particularly bloody decade of conflict, the kingdoms had finally committed to an era of peace, and so were now commonly referred to as the peaceful kingdoms. This peace ushered in a new era of trade and diplomacy, although each kingdom maintained a strong militaristic character, and they were still technically all independent of one another. Darlantia knew from studying his mother's books and maps that there were 5 kingdoms in total, 2 of which bordered the great wilderness, and so hunting, gathering, and lumber were where they focused on. The biggest kingdom inhabited a vast flat plain, ideal for crops and livestock. The smallest lived in a mountainous and hilly region, rich in metals and other natural resources. According to Twittle, the 5th kingdom, Litoria, was now the most successful among them, as their land mostly comprised of the coastline. The ports built in an era of peace now attracted merchants from all over the known world. This 5th kingdom then controlled the flow of goods, both coming in and out of the peaceful kingdoms, and had prospered. This prosperity and influence then took on a new form when the ruling king and queen sired a pair of twins, rich in magical ability, very rare and uncommon among humans. Twittle's knowledge only went so far, as he admitted he had spent most of his time alone in the great wilderness. How a humble sparrow had an affinity for language, and had supposedly lived the past 50 years in the flesh, remained a mystery. Darlantia was pondering this as he flew over the fertile lands of the biggest kingdom, eyeing up herds of sheep and cattle to feed himself. He decided his best course of action was to head to each kingdom's capital, where he could meet the rulers and gather up-to-date resources for his mother's collection. Twittle thought it was the noblest quest indeed, and decided to join him on the adventure. After plucking some cows from a field, and causing an old farmer to scream and shout as he darted into a cottage, was when Twittle offered up some particularly interesting information that he had not mentioned the entire morning. "Oh, there is one thing I forgot to mention," Twittle said. "Which is?" Darlantia queried. "Well, the case of the invasion, of course." "Invasion?" Darlantia responded in surprise. "Yes, invasion. It must have been about a week ago. A particularly annoying crow who loves to gossip came to annoy me with her constant chatter. But on this occasion what she spoke was quite interesting, although possibly just a silly rumour." "Do tell." "Well, apparently the biggest port in all the land, Litograd, crowning jewel of Literia's coast, was invaded by an armada of minotaurs and lizard men. But most extraordinarily was her claim that they were only successful because they were joined by a dragon and wizard Twittle finished off excitedly. That does sound exciting, thought Darlantia, but also possibly dangerous. He didn't want to get swept up into a war, especially one involving one of his own kind. Conflict between dragons was strictly forbidden, at least in the Dragon Kingdom. The biggest port, you say? So then if we head east a little further, we could be there by midday, Darlantia said. I expect so, Twittle said. Shall we see if the rumour is true? It can't hurt to look, but first I must eat these cows. Perhaps that farmer has some bread for me, Twittle beamed. After a few hours' flight, Darlantia and Twittle arrived at their destination just after midday. Flying just below the cloud layer, Darlantia surveyed the land below. Directly below him was a multi-tiered city with circular walls of golden brown stone. The city was adorned with trees and other plant life, such as ivy, stretching across walls, and was home to impressive buildings made of the same light stone as the walls, with shimmering bronze roofs. There appeared to be 4 tiers to this city. The lowest tier looked to be a ring of residential homes. The second, home to businesses, workshops, and markets. The third seemed to be made up entirely of barracks and training grounds. At the very top was a humble, but still large, palace that the King and Queen Twittle mentioned likely ruled from. The city was a hub of activity, with lots of people going about their business. Noticeably, however, there were dozens of guards on the walls that overlooked each tier of the city, and at the barracks and training grounds they could see lots of training and drills being carried out. To Darlantia it seemed the invasion must be true to warrant such activity. Despite this, Darlantia was amazed and excited by what he saw. This was, after all, the first ever major settlement he had seen in his whole life. Twittle lacked the eyesight to take it all in, and was instead hiding from the buffeting wind behind Darlantia's head. But he was still able to offer up some additional information in response to Darlantia's queries. Each tier of the city was apparently in honor of a planet that could be observed in the night sky, with gates, bridges, and streets named after comets, moons, and stars. Twittle further explained that the kingdom of Litoria honored and prayed to no gods or deities. Rather, the celestial bodies observed in the night sky formed the basis of their belief system and culture, with the sun naturally being of the most importance. Outside the city there was no visible signs of conflict. Instead, all there was to see was mostly just flat farmlands and a few scattered woodlands. From the city there was a clear road that led to the sea, and alongside it was some strange track of metal and wood. Twittle said it was used for some monstrous form of transportation. Leaving the city behind for now, Darlantia followed the line of track and road. To the north there was a small mountain. The flat plateau at its peak captured rainfall that spilled from its rim, cascading in a misty waterfall that fell from the top into a deep pool below. It was a beautiful marvel, and Darlantia thought that if the story had been different, perhaps he would have made home there. Just a few minutes more flight, however, and an even greater marvel emerged. Opening up before Darlantia was a large bay. The town on its shores appeared to be mostly destroyed and burnt, and hundreds of tents had been erected outside the walls. The bay itself was choked with both the wreckage of various boats and ships, and, a little further out, fully intact longships. The true sight to behold, however, was the large mountain in the centre of the bay, with an impressive, but partly destroyed castle perched on top. The entire area was teeming with ferocious-looking minotaurs, as well as a smaller number of lizard men. Darlantia knew that both races originated far to the south, on an entirely different continent. Noticeably, this army had hunkered down in the port town, but according to Twittle's source, it had invaded at least a week ago. "Whoa!" Twittle suddenly exclaimed. "What is it?" Darlantia asked. "Can you feel that?" "Feel what?" "I can sense some kind of strong energy, almost as if it's calling out," Twittle explained. "That's odd. I can't feel anything, Darlantia replied. It sounds like voices calling out, like a whisper on the wind, but I can't fully make it out. The dragon could hear the confusion in his sparrow friend's voice. Where is it coming from? From the castle on top of that mountain, I think. Hey, do me a favor and fly a little closer, Twittle requested. Darlantia obliged, circling down towards the castle. Yes, that's it. I can hear it more clearly. It's not one voice, but 4 perhaps? I still can't hit what they are saying exactly. Get closer, Darlantia. Darlantia did as asked yet again, but was starting to feel a little uneasy as the heavily armed guards became more visible. All it would take was one look for the entire place to be alerted to the circling dragon above. I can make it out now. Something is shouting out, "Help!" in unison. Suddenly, a loud horn was blown, and the Minotaurs on the ramparts instantly jumped into action. Darlantia wanted to explain he meant no harm, so foolishly flew in closer to see if he could defuse the situation. The vigorous shouting followed by a volley of spears and throwing axes instantly put a stop to that. Let's get out of here, Twittle yelled. Darlantia flew back towards the bay. On top of one of the towers stood a heavily armored Minotaur, almost twice the size of the others. With both hands he launched a massive axe overhead, which hit Darlantia's wing joint as he flew past. In annoyance, Darlantia launched a quick fireball that exploded on top of the large tower, sending the assembled Minotaurs there diving in all directions. The heavily armored one roared in fury and threw another smaller axe hurtling towards Darlantia. This one missed by a mile as Darlantia gained altitude to escape the increasingly hostile situation. Something about this doesn't feel right to me, Twittle said. Darlantia didn't reply. The axe that hit him was still lodged near his wing joint. Thankfully, as far as he can tell, it hadn't done any serious damage. He decided he would land on top of the waterfall mountain they had passed to safely remove it. As he neared the mountain, he suddenly became aware of a large shadow looming over him. Incoming! Twittle yelled, but too late. Darlantia looked up in horror as a huge black mass pummeled into him from above. Thanks for listening. The full Darlantia book is available on Amazon, link in the description, and subscribe for weekly readings from the book.